assuming this war ends, there's a day that it ends. Pick the number, 2, 3 things that you hope Israel prioritizes when this war, if this war ends.
Yeah. 3 things. Number 1 is unity. In other words, that Israeli society understands that while healthy disagreement is part of the Jewish people's character and a democracy, it is a national security threat to be at each other's throats. And we've got too many fish to fry here for our tribal differences to be bigger than our shared national objectives. And I think there is a moment now in Israeli society where leaders who talk about who they can work with, not who they can't work with, have more appeal, because I think it's intuitively understood in a big chunk of the Israeli public that we need to move in that direction. And we need to be much more tender with each other. Mm-hmm. The kind of tenderness. That's all. Number 2 is, in my view, just a real serious strategic outlook, right? In terms of that combination of factors that is required to, on the one hand, push back, degrade, defeat, delegitimize the enemies of peace, and empower other forces in the region. It includes how we talk either to a Trump or a Harris administration about how critical this is to U.S. national security interests, not just to our own. Mm-hmm. Iran is helping us there with its alliance with China and Russia and North Korea and so on. It's not a difficult case to make, but we need to be able to speak to others, not just to ourselves, about that. And strategy here is, the US puts it an all of government approach. It's an all of society approach. There are so many components to it. We can't limit it to the military. It's strategic communications. It's peace building. It's 1,000,001 different, it's economy. It's a whole host of things. And getting more strategic, I think, is critical. And the third thing, at the risk of sounding strange in this moment that so many of us are living in this moment, this is about peace. We need to be in the business of aspirations. We need to give a direction, not just to ourselves, but to those around us, about what we are hoping for. Because it's very, very hard to generate momentum and energy just behind a message of we are going to live by the sword and that's all there is. I remain of the view that it's not inevitable, nothing is inevitable, but it's not impossible that in a few years' time we will look back on this moment and say, we had to confront the enemies of peace in order to create this much better Middle East. And by the way, we were never going to get there without confronting the enemies of peace. They were never going to take it lying down, that we would make progress with the Saudis, and that there was always going to be that effort to spoil in one form or another. And I think if we don't discount the possibility that in a few years' time, we will analyze this moment through that lens, that it was a necessary part of building it. If we don't discount the possibility, we may be able actually to build towards that possibility and reverse backwards from it, right? And ask ourselves, what would we need to do to make the idea that Jews belong in the Middle East an idea that is acceptable in the Muslim world, and the idea that Palestinians belong, as long as they're not in the business of trying to destroy. I'm not saying that we should be silly about it, but Palestinians have rights that we are sensitive to and aware of, that is something that Israeli Jewish society can embrace without feeling that it's being naive or endangering itself. And maybe we can reverse engineer, not just from seeing the strategic dangers, but also seeing the strategic opportunity.
The speed with which things can change. I mean, on the one hand, I always tell people who visit Israel for the first time, I say, you've got to completely readjust how you think about space when you're in Israel, geography, and you have to completely readjust how you think about time.
Yes.
Because the time spans that Israelis and their neighbors talk about conflicts and disputes is just, you can't compare it to anything in an American or even a European context. At the same time, 1973, Yom Kippur War, talked about a trauma for Israel, as you said earlier. Yeah. And Israel appears, at least at one point in that war, to be a paper tiger in the Middle East. and the self-image of Israel as this triumphant victor after the Six-Day War comes crashing down on the war fronts of the Yom Kippur War. And then who would have thought in 1977 Anwar Sadat would fly to Israel, stand before Israel's parliament and say, I want peace. I recognize there's a right to exist. Could you have had that without the Yom Kippur War? So in a sense, it's a version of what you're saying.
So this is what, I don't know if you liked it or you didn't like it, but that's what I mean by the permanent possibility of the presently unimaginable. That has been a feature of Jewish history and certainly a feature of Israeli history, that you looked at this moment and you were sure it couldn't spin, and it spun, right? And if you don't discount it, you can actually create conditions for it. You mentioned space is a big problem. I remember, I think when President Bush flew on a helicopter, Ariel Sharon took him on a helicopter. Yeah. He famously said, we have parking lots in Texas bigger than this, or something like that. And you're absolutely right about that dynamic. One other thing maybe I want to say in relation to the challenge and the opportunity that I think is important. When you try to simplify, let's take the Iranian regime strategy with respect to Israel, when you try to just break it down to a simple thing, I think it is either Israel defends itself and then it's labeled a pariah, or it doesn't defend itself and are able to, advance their horrific agenda, right? And that is by this unbearable, reprehensible tactic. That is not a tactic, it's a strategy. It's kind of the essence of Hamas's strategy of using civilians in that way. By the way, one of the reasons why Israel's compliance with the law is so important, because what we're demonstrating is we are not like Hamas. It's almost as if Sinwar is offering Palestinian civilian death as an offering to Allah, as a kind of gift to Allah. It's his demonstration of his devotion, right? In a really sick and problematic way. And our ability to not be like that is critical. And it is very, very difficult in the reality of warfare. And this plays a particular role. This pariah stuff, I think, plays a particular role in the international arena, right? Because Iran doesn't get to label us a pariah, right? It's not doing that great itself in terms of its reputation. And it requires the kind of cooperation, complicity, maybe useful idiots sometimes who play that role as well. And sometimes also voices in Israel that, in my view, are illiberal or not sensitive enough to these issues can put fuel on the fire. And one of the challenges we have at the moment, I think, relates particularly to some of the UN bodies. Because for too many in the world, when you say the UN says X, you are saying a body with authority, legitimacy, and credibility has determined X. Yeah. How exactly did it earn that credibility and legitimacy and authority? If it's the parts of the UN that have been regurgitating the statistics of a genocidal terrorist organization as if they are the facts on the ground, then why are they given that legitimacy? If it's essentially the non-democratic human rights violators who are shaping the agenda and the outcome, why are we giving it? And this is, I think, a fundamental challenge to the West, not just to Israel, because these are institutions that were established to advance rule of law and democracy, and they have turned to be the facilitators very often of the violators of those. And so part of the effort, and this is why I talk about a strategy, right, across the board effort, part of the effort is getting serious about not allowing the hijacking of international institutions by those that are trying to undermine the very values that those institutions were established to achieve in the first place. That is also part of confronting Iran. And that's also part of creating a dynamic in which genuine peace and coexistence that sees Jews as having a right to self-determination alongside Palestinians, that sees the idea that Jews have security as a legitimate thing that stands alongside the idea that Palestinians have a way to see to their future and so on. And so there are a lot of different aspects to pushing back on it.